He's here. Gog of Magog is here on this earth right now. But Christians just don't recognize him. If Jesus is returning in our lifetimes, as we've demonstrated on this channel many times, then Gog is already here. To which a lot of people say, well, it's Putin. And to which we say, don't be so sure. In fact, this channel believes it is almost assuredly not Putin. However, this is a very important question because whether you're pre-trib or pre-wrath or even a preterist, you can expect that you or your children may see Gog leading his hordes against Israel. You may not have thought about it, but most would agree with us that he is here. What you probably haven't considered, though, is that Gog of Magog may have something to do with the covenant with the many, the making of it and the breaking of it. If you read Ezekiel 38 carefully, that's the Gog of Magog chapter, the invasion of Israel involves some, but not all, the nations in the Middle East. Why is that? It seems only half the nations are part of it. The missing nations, for the most part, seem to be those nations that are part of the Abraham Accords that were signed between Israel and Arab nations under the Trump administration. Isn't that interesting? So we're going to discuss a lot of this today. Gog's identity, how this war fits with the covenant that's coming, and when that invasion might happen, etc. Even though everyone wants to know Gog's identity, like right off the bat, the first question we should probably ask is, when does the invasion happen? In order to know who Gog is, it's important to know where he comes from and when he attacks Israel. There are 4 ideas on this: at the beginning of the tribulation, at the middle, at the end, and some even think, based on Revelation 20, that it happens after the millennium. One thing that everyone agrees on, however, is it didn't happen in the past. There's a lot of confusion about this when question, so my guess is the listeners of this channel are completely divided on this one. But I ask you to put aside your preconceived notions, at least for a moment, and look at the situation based on Scripture. First, let's look at the idea that the Gog of Magog battle is strictly in the distant future, at the end of a 1,000-year millennial kingdom, because I'm sure some of you believe that. Revelation 20, after all, we learn that Satan is released after being imprisoned for 1,000 years and leads the hordes of Gog and Magog against Israel. So there's no doubt that a Gog and Magog-like battle happens in the distant future, but that it just might be a repeat of what is going to happen in the end times that we're quickly approaching. That's our theory. There's no reason that there has to only be one Gog of Magog invasion. There could be 2. Lots of things in the Bible are repeats of things that have happened in the past. So why am I saying that the Gog of Magog battle can't just be in the distant future in Revelation 20 after the millennium? Well, there's some things that happen when Jesus defeats Gog of Magog that can only happen back before the millennial kingdom. Listen to some of these. Ezekiel 38:23. I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. Well, if Jesus was reigning for 1,000 years, I think everybody knew him. Another verse that speaks to this same thing is Ezekiel 39:7. I will make known my holy name among my people Israel. I will no longer let my holy name be profaned. Again, if Jesus was reigning for 1,000 years, these things would have already taken place. So Israel would have already known Jesus. He was their king. These are the reasons that it has to be something that takes place in the end times. It can't just be something that happens at the far end of the millennium. So we're saying, yes, it does happen at the end of the millennium, but that's a repeat of something that happened in the end times. So that leaves 3 possibilities for the invasion, either at the beginning, middle, or end of the 70th week of Daniel. And by far the most popular view is that it takes place at the very beginning, maybe even before it. That's strange to me. as it is the one possibility that has the least biblical evidence. Ezekiel 38, 8, 11, and 14 all describe Israel as being at peace, a people of unwalled villages at that time. Is that the state of Israel now? No. Rather, it sounds like a time after a peace covenant has taken place, doesn't it? So why would anyone think it happens before the tribulation? Well, that's what it says in the popular books left behind in the late great planet Earth. It's tradition. Tradition is not a strong enough reason for us to think this way. There is zero evidence it happens before the 70th week, and lots of evidence that the invasion happens after it starts. Our view is that the invasion occurs at the middle of the 70th week, the same time that Jesus and the prophet Daniel tell us Israel is invaded and trampled by the Gentiles, and that the Gog of Magog invasion isn't just a single day, a month, or even a year, that the battle, rather, is a war that extends over the entire last 3.5 years, or the Great Tribulation, which of course fits perfectly with the return of Jesus when he's going to put down his enemies. We'll look at further evidence for this later in this teaching, but in a nutshell, the Gog of Magog invasion starts at the midpoint and ends at Armageddon. But Ezekiel 38, the Gog of Magog chapter, names of the nations involved. That's where this covenant with the many, the peace covenant, comes into play. Let's look at the nations that are named in the passage, Ezekiel 38, 1 through 5. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech, Tubal, and prophesy against him. Persia, Cush, and Put are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all his hordes, Beth Togarmah, from the uttermost parts of the north, with all his hordes. Now, in this whole group, maybe you recognize Persia, but that's probably it. But 8 total ancient nations are listed. God gave Ezekiel the names of the nations, what they were called back in Ezekiel's day. So for us to figure out these 8 ancient nations, we need to figure out where these land masses are today. All the names except Persia go back to Genesis 10 and the grandsons and great-grandsons of Noah. Magog, Meshech, Tubal, and Gomer were sons of Japheth. Togarmah was Gomer's son, and Cush and Put were sons of Ham. So all of us know Persia is the name of the landmass that currently the nation of Iran occupies. Probably none of us have problems with that. But what areas of land did Magog, Meshech, Tubal, and the rest occupy? Now, Cush is universally thought to be Sudan, and Put is thought to be Libya. But what about the others? The most important, of course, is Magog, because Gog comes from Magog. If we're going to identify Gog, we need to know where Magog is. Now, back in the 1800s, Oxford scholar A.H. Sayce investigated the ancient court records of the Assyrian Empire. And all these nations, Magog, Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, were all trading partners of the Assyrian Empire. They knew where these countries were. They were located in the region currently known as Turkey, in the northern areas of Syria and Iraq, and around the Black Sea, like Azerbaijan. They were north of the Assyrian Empire. But they were not found in Russia. Russia, being part of the Gog-Magog invasion, is another fabrication of the late great planet Earth and the Left Behind series. These books were so popular that they have influenced Bible scholars ever since. The reason Hal Lindsey came up with the Russia connection is the word ROSH in the passage. He thought this was a country name, and he figured it sounded like Russia, so it must be that country. And this was easy to conceive back then, because the USA was in a Cold War with Russia at the time, and Russia's really been the USA's enemy for quite some time. Rosh, however, is a common Hebrew word meaning head. Rosh Hashanah meaning head of the year. So this word Rosh is the term that tells us that Gog is a head prince or chief prince of Magog, Meshech, and Tubal. Russia is not part of this. And, that pretty much eliminates Putin. Some additional Bible scholars will say, well, what about the Scythians? People from Magog migrated up to Russia so that in the days of Josephus, which was around the time of the destruction of the temple, 70 A.D., Israelites called the Scythians Magogites because they came from the area of Magog. Yeah, and where did they go after that? And after that? And where did the Persians go? The world has mixed and mingled and traveled and migrated to such an extent we cannot use migration records to determine where these nations were. What matters is where were the nations when the prophecy was given to Ezekiel. And the answer is Magog was in Turkey at that time, and that's what we have to use as the basis. So Russia is eliminated as a possibility for the Magog War. And now you know why so many popular teachers get this wrong and get the timing wrong, saying it happens before the tribulation. Both of these ideas were popularized in books in the 1970s, The Late Great Planet Earth and Left Behind. Next time you hear someone saying these things, you know where it came from now. But Gog, he's from Magog, which is from parts of modern Turkey, Syria, or Iraq. So the first thought coming into your mind again is it this guy, Erdogan? We'll discuss that in a moment. But first, just as interesting as who part of the Gog-Magog group of nations is, are which nations aren't part of it. Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the countries in the Arabian Peninsula. Some of these, as we said, have signed the Abraham Accord peace deals with Israel, and others are considering it. Now, does this have something to do with why nations are aligned in Ezekiel 38 the way they are? Well, if we read the passage, it seems to. Listen to this. Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish, and all its leaders will say to you, Gog, have you come to seize spoil? Have you assembled your hordes to carry off plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to seize great spoil? These nations are listed in this part of the prophecy. Nations that aren't part of Gog's army. Nations that question Gog and his motives. They're listed as Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish. Although Sheba has come to be thought of as an African country in today's world, that isn't biblically correct. It's also a nation from Genesis 10, who along with Dedan settled in the Arabian Peninsula. Dedan is thought to be Saudi Arabia today, and Sheba likely the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Tarshish has long thought to be the western nations of the USA and Europe. And the fact that these are associated with merchants just reinforces this and even makes me think of Mystery Babylon, whose merchants, after all, rule that empire. So if we're correct, this says the Abraham Accord nations, the Saudis, who will likely join the Accord, and the Western powers all see Gog invading and do nothing to stop them. They question Gog, but they don't go any further. Now, in the previous video in this series, we summarized that these nations will sign a mutual protection pact. But if this is true, looks like they're not going to live with it. We theorized this might be the covenant with death from Isaiah 28 that Israel is going to sign, and which is built on falsehood and lies. And if we read Ezekiel, as we just did, we can see that there comes a point where Israel's allies, Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish, looks like they just don't do anything to help Israel in its greatest moment of need. Now, in that previous video, and there is a link down in the description too, so you can go back and watch that if you need a refresher, we also theorized that the northern Muslim nations, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, are going to be angry with the Saudis and the other Abraham Accord nations because they're going to allow Israel to begin sacrifices on the Temple Mount. A really big deal to these nations because in their eyes, it's the third holiest site in Islam, and that Israel has no right to be on the Temple Mount. But if you remember in that previous video, the Saudis were trading the right to do sacrifices in order to divide the land of Israel and create a homeland, a Hashemite kingdom of Palestine, where the Palestinians and Jordanians would form one nation under the control of Jordan. Well, this is all well and good from these southern Arab nations' point of view, but from the northern nations' point of view, they want to put a stop to these sacrifices. And that is a major reason for this Gog of Magog invasion as they come into Israel and, of course, at the midpoint of the tribulation, stop the sacrifices. That's how we see all of this fitting together. And as we mentioned, it's likely that these southern Arab nations enter in a mutual protection pact with Israel. But when push comes to shove, they back off. They don't help Israel at all, and they allow this northern horde to come into Israel and stop the sacrifices. However, these nations aren't off the hook. If we read the book of Daniel, this avoidance of Gog only can last for a while. These same countries in Israel seem to be listed in Daniel 11:39 through 41 as well. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses, not USA and Europe maybe, with the help of a foreign god. At the time of the end, the king of the south, and that could be Saudis, Egypt, Abraham Accord nations, shall attack him. But the king of the north, Gog, shall rush upon them like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and with many ships, and shall come into the glorious land, which is Israel. And God himself tells us who Gog is. Thus says the Lord God, are you he who I spoke of in former days by my servants the prophets of Israel, who in those days prophesied for years that I would bring you against them? Ezekiel 38:17. This is probably the key verse in determining who Gog is and who he isn't. Do you know what prophets and what verses God is speaking of here? Do you know who was speaking of Gog back in the ancient days? If you don't, maybe your theory of who Gog is needs to be reevaluated. There is only one great Gentile leader who comes against the people of Israel, the little horn, the Antichrist. In Daniel 8, by the way, it refers to the coming of his little horn after a Turkish invasion of Iran, and that the original leader of Turkey is deposed of at that time, and a new leader eventually rises, who will be this little horn or Antichrist. So there's your answer about Erdogan also, not him either. But where in the Bible does it have anything to say about this Gog character? Yeah, we're assuming Gog is the Antichrist, but does it mention him directly? Because God clearly said his prophets spoke of him. Now, Gog isn't found elsewhere in our traditional English Old Testament, and that causes problems. But in the Greek Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, Gog is mentioned several other times. In Amos 7:1, it refers to Gog as the caterpillar king or the locust king. Locusts, as per Joel 2, the army of the Antichrist. So Gog appears again to be the Antichrist. And this is the one who we think is here on the earth now. He just hasn't been revealed yet. In Numbers 24:7, Gog is referred to, and he's defeated by the Messiah. Travis Snow and I did a video on this a few years ago. Click right here to keep watching, because it really is a very instructive video that fully explains what role Gog plays in the end times. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.